Okay, I'm going to do a proper video on Jeffrey Epstein. I've been ducking from it for many years, but my hand has been forced because it looks like now no one has the guts to stand up and do what's right and silence his complicity. To paraphrase the great Lutheran pastor Martin Niebola, first they came for Jimmy Savile, and I did not speak out because I was not Jimmy Savile. Then they came for Diddy, and I did not speak out because I was not Diddy. Then they came for Jeffrey Epstein, and I did not speak out because I was not Jeffrey Epstein. Then they came for Trump, and now I look like a fucking idiot when I try and defend him in his wonderful secret. Seriously, I think it's important that the more far-out questions surrounding Jeffrey Epstein don't get relegated to being solely investigated or pushed solely by Pizzagate-type conspiracy theorists, because they've got enough on their hands investigating Balenciaga, Tony Podesta, and Frazzle Drip. So today I'll lend my very credible establishment voice to the cause of earning some ad rev and game the algorithm by talking about Jeffrey Epstein. I actually do have a couple of interesting points to make regarding fairly tenuous yet fascinating Australian connections, which in a way adds credibility to the theory that he was connected to intelligence. And after all, according to certain fugitive journalists, I practically was on that island. Now, let me say a bunch of keywords, so this video is recommended by YouTube. Epstein files, client list, Jeffrey Epstein, Ghislaine Maxwell, Mr. Beast was on the island. All right, roll the intro. Bear with me if you're already across the Epstein lore, but I think it's kind of important to do a bit of a history lesson here. The biography and history of Jeffrey Epstein is incredibly opaque, as Donald Trump labeled him. He wasn't that big of a factor in terms of life. But broadly, this is what is known. Epstein grew up middle class in Brooklyn, studied mathematical physiology at NYU for a few years before dropping out after being hired by the prestigious Dalton School to teach physics and maths. This was quite an unusual hire for a school as prestigious as Dalton, as Epstein didn't have a degree and was only 21. The headmaster of Dalton, who left a semester before Epstein began working there, was Donald Barr. Now, here are some of the first strange connections. Donald Barr served in World War II with the Office of Strategic Services. That was the precursor to the CIA. He's the father of William Barr, US Attorney General under George Bush Sr. and Donald Trump, specifically during the time Epstein died in federal custody, awaiting trial. Oh, and he also wrote a science fiction novel about child sex slavery called Space Relations, which was published a year before Epstein went to work at Dalton. That's not a joke or an exaggeration. You can see why QAnon loves this shit. Like, that book has to be a coincidence, but fucking hell. It's like Epstein's life is a book. He's barely out of school, and the level of cosmic foreshadowing going on is off the charts. It'd be too on the nose to write it like this. Also, remember this, Donald Barr's son, William Barr, before becoming Attorney General, worked for the CIA. The significance of that will become apparent later on. And again, these connections don't at all prove any thesis I may or may not be cooking. They're just worth noting. Back to Epstein though, in 1976, he gets dismissed from the Dalton School for reportedly being kind of a sloppy teacher, but he moves up, getting a job at Wall Street investment bank Bear Stearns by impressing executive Alan Greenberg, whose daughter attended Dalton. At Bear Stearns, he quickly moves up the ranks, becoming a limited partner and is assigned to the special products division, where it was his job basically to help the super rich come up with tax avoidance strategies. You know, setting up trusts, moving stuff offshore, money laundering through the secondary Labubu market. Forget about the trusts! When do we get to the freaking pedophilia? That's exactly what Epstein was probably thinking. And so in 1981, he went solo, starting up a few ventures, one of which was J. Epstein & Co., founded in 82. It was a financial management firm that was basically run entirely by Jeffrey Epstein's gut instinct. It would be wrong to say it specialized in managing assets for the uber rich, because that's apparently only what it did. Epstein reportedly refused to take on clients with a net worth of under $1 billion. Like, it's actually been reported that people with $700 million and $500 million were turned down by Epstein. And mind you, this would have been in the 80s, 90s, early 2000s, when $1 billion could buy you a lot more eggs. What an incredibly limiting and strange business idea. But the more interesting company was Intercontinental Asset Group, which billed itself as somewhat of a bounty hunter firm that recovered stolen or lost money. It's been reported that Saudi arms deal Adnan Khashoggi was one of the International Asset Group's clients. You remember that name. In 2003, journalist Vicky Ward, who wrote the first real profile on Epstein, more recently reported it was arms dealer Douglas Leese who introduced Epstein to Adnan Khashoggi and a whole bunch of other players, including $500 million Ponzi scheme architect Stephen Hoffenberg, who Epstein would go on to work for. Ward reported that Hoffenberg claimed that Epstein revealed to him how he made his money through a technique called, how's this, playing the box. This is from an article by Ward, quote, "He ensured that even if his crime was uncovered, the victim would be unable to do anything about it, either because of social embarrassment or because the money was tucked away in a place where they couldn't either find it or get it." Epstein eventually played the box with Hoffenberg himself. Cooperating with prosecutors against his old boss, who had already pleaded guilty to securities fraud, Hoffenberg claimed that this was despite the fact that Epstein took a cool $100 million from the scheme and moved it offshore. Yet there was nothing he could do, as Hoffenberg had no discovery, as he'd already pled guilty. This is just really interesting because doesn't playing the box almost perfectly describe the more far out conspiracies that theorize of a blackmail intelligence operation? Theories that have been described by ex-Israeli spies themselves. Just wait, we're getting to it. Now, Ward reported that Hoffenberg also claimed that Epstein moved in intelligence circles, which is pretty obvious if you think about who Epstein's ride or die Ghislaine Maxwell's father is or was: British MP, come newspaper publisher, come guy who died by falling off a boat under incredibly suspicious circumstances, Robert Maxwell. It was pretty much public record at this point that he was involved in intelligence, if not somewhat of a Mossad asset. He was all but given an Israeli state funeral. During the 1980s, Epstein also began handling Victoria's Secret billionaire Les Wexner's assets. I won't get into this today because there's just so many avenues to go down, but Wexner is the only publicly known high net worth client of J. Epstein and Co. And Wexner not only employed Epstein's services, he gave him power of attorney over everything, which is just bizarre. This is how Epstein gets his giant Manhattan residence, private jet, luxury Ohio estate, just going, "Oh yeah, Les wants to give me these things." This is even stranger once you've heard the Hoffenberg context. Now that I've rattled off a bunch of these names, this is an Australian channel, so let's get to the kind of maybe tenuous but very interesting Australian connection, Kevin Rudd. No, just joking, there's this idiot online that makes up conspiracy theories about me and has this weird hate boner for our former Prime Minister and claims that he's an Epstein pedo collaborator with his trademark investigative strategy of misreading mainstream articles and not understanding them. Anyway, I think that got them off the shelf. Don't worry, Kevin. Our secret's safe. Enigmas never age. For the Australia League, first I'm going to have to explain the Iran-Contra affair quickly. I know this sounds like it's going everywhere, but this is actually what a real Epstein video looks like. Deal with it. During the Reagan administration, the US would illegally sell weapons to Iran via Israel, then divert the proceeds to the Contras in Nicaragua, a right-wing terrorist organization which the US Congress had banned the Reagan administration from funding. Look it up. A real beautiful time in US history, and an even more beautiful time for Nicaraguans. To do this, the US government needed to utilize a whole lot of front companies, arms dealers and transshipping avenues. Epstein client Adnan Khashoggi was one of them. The key source for exposing the Iran-Contra affair was Israeli spy Ari Ben-Banashi. Ben-Banashi initially attempted to leak the story to Time journalist Raji Sambagati. Yet, after nothing was published, he reportedly went to Lebanese paper Al-Shara, who exposed the story in 1986, leading to a mass scandal and congressional hearing in which Ben-Banashi was a witness. But an often forgotten part of the scandal was that after it broke and after the legal fallout and some foul prosecutions, Ben-Banashi moved to Australia for a year in 1991. It's often forgotten that he also alleged that during Iran-Contra, weapons were being transshipped through Western Australia. This was never really investigated by Australian authorities and would take another video entirely to even begin to cover it properly. But this is why it's interesting. It's public record that then opposition leader and future Australian Prime Minister John Howard had multiple meetings with Ari Ben-Banashi to discuss these claims of transshipping that, if properly investigated, most likely would have been seriously damaging to some of Howard's opponents in Labor. Howard never publicly questioned the veracity of Ben-Banashi. In fact, he said this about him:
that I was sufficiently interested and impressed with what he had to say to go on listening.
This is significant because John Howard is so dispositionally conservative that the only conspiracy theory he's ever indulged is Iraq having WMDs. He ain't going to be taking multiple meetings with just some wacko conspiracy theorist, which is what the Israelis were desperate to paint Ben-Banashi as. Ben-Banashi was Israeli intelligence. There's no dispute. How does this tie into Epstein, though? Well, the first person to publicly allege a blackmail operation being run by Epstein as an intelligence asset was Ari Ben-Banashi. Ben-Banashi alleged in 2019 that he was introduced to Epstein by Robert Maxwell in the 1980s, in the middle of the Iran-Contra dealings. He said that Maxwell wanted to bring Epstein in on the arms transfers. Oh, and remember attorney William Barr, son of Donald Barr, the man who gave Epstein his first real job? Well, he was the Attorney General who recommended the pardon of 6 officials involved in Iran-Contra, and was also the Attorney General around 30 years later when Epstein died in federal custody. You just take a lot of this with a grain of salt, though, because much of what I've said is circumstantial and just kind of interesting. But at the same time, it is worth noting that there has been no real credible rebuttal to some of the more piercing allegations. And it's not like these sort of operations don't happen, the moving heaps of black money for secret arms deals. I'm still a little bit iffy on the whole Epstein Mansion blackmail movie studios, although having a bunch of hidden cameras and investigators finding a trove of DVDs labelled young name plus name doesn't really help Israel's, Epstein's case. There is further evidence pointing to Epstein being intelligence. Trump's former Labor Secretary Alex Acosta was the man in charge of prosecuting Epstein in Florida back in 2008, yet Acosta gave him the human trafficking sentencing equivalent of when Bruz got a free pass to whack cameraman because of his mental health. It was reported that when he was being vetted to join the first Trump administration as Labor Secretary, Acosta was asked why he went so soft on Epstein, and he explained, I was told Epstein belonged to intelligence and to leave it alone. Could just be more of a strategic answer than I'm actually pro-child prostitution and as Labor Secretary, I will work to secure the rights of child sex workers, or, he could just be stating what's pretty obvious. I mean, all smart governments have intelligence agencies. Israel and the US have intelligence agencies. Intelligence agencies have assets and operations. On the balance of probabilities, I'd say it's pretty obvious Epstein was moving money for some interesting reasons. But to really get to the bottom of this whole Israeli blackmail theory, I'd have to see some first-hand evidence. Gee, I would be really, really embarrassed if someone, or some country perhaps, got me on tape making love to a WWE wrestler. That would be my nightmare. I would hate for that to happen, and really don't want this scenario to be set up should someone or some country want to blackmail me in the future. My desire to be fucked by a WWE wrestler does not outweigh the shame that I would have of a video of that if it were to come out. And I'm definitely not aroused by the idea of that video leaking. Okay, Israel? You hear that? Anyway, that's all that we've got for today, but you let me know if you want more Epstein content. Not the tapes, just, videos like this. Because there's definitely more paths to go down, such as how all this Jeffrey Epstein Trump stuff is just a cover to distract from the real scandal, Pizzagate.